Back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio on Saturday, the 20th of December. We hope you've had a good term. We hope that you've broken up. We hope that you survived or thrived, depending on your point of view. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I've got Jim Gamble with me, who I'll introduce in just a moment. Before we do that, thank you very much to our sponsors and partners on this morning's show. We've got Hachette Learning, who are publishers of professional development books and resources for teachers around the world. Check them out at the Hachette Learning website. And we've also got the Bet Show, which is coming up very fast, actually, on the 21st to the 23rd of January. The Bet Show in London's Excel Centre. Get over there, free tickets available. And yeah, head over there. It's going to be fantastic. We'll be there. We've got a stand we're exhibiting at the Bet Show. Jim, welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. How are you today? All right?
Well, I'm good, yeah. This time on a Saturday morning, it's not the best place to be in work, but I think everybody, especially in teaching, understands that work doesn't finish at the end of a normal working day. Sure.
Well, listen, thank you very much for taking the time out to speak to us this morning. Really appreciate it, because I know how busy you are. Obviously, we're going to be talking about the Mossbourne Safeguarding review and the report that came from that. Now, I wanted to start maybe by you telling listeners and viewers what your role was within this whole process.
Well, I am the Independent Safeguarding Children's Commissioner for the City of London and Hackney, and in old money, that is the independent chair of the Safeguarding Children Partnership. So my role involves that of scrutineer. So I have a right to roam when it comes to looking at multi-agency partnerships, whether it's in policing, education, health, children's social care, or the third sector. And so any relevant agency to provide a level of reassurance through multi-agency audit and other engagements that, you know, safeguarding standards are being met and that we're all on this continuous journey of improvement. But in essence, whilst I chair the group, the decisions when it comes to issues such as will we have a child safeguarding practice review, those decisions are unanimous. They are generally made by 10, 15 or 20 within the safeguarding partnership. So that's where you bring the combined experience of health with children's and adolescent mental health experts in the room, pediatricians in the room, police and criminal justice around youth justice in the room, people with a background in education in the room. And that's brought together so that we make these decisions through the lens of safeguarding first, so through the lens of lessons learned, rather than attributing blame or indeed, we most definitely aren't about conduct.
In terms of that, because there'll be a lot of people, including me, it seems quite complex in terms of how the review comes about. So when you said all these people in the room, they're part of the local authority. So we had the website that was set up called Educating Hackney. That then, I guess, fed into the local authority, who then decided that a review would take place. But were you involved in that decision for the review to take place, or are you only involved after that point?
No, I was involved in the decision that the review was necessary. But the story of the Mossbourne Victoria Park Academy local child safeguarding practice review doesn't begin or end with Educating Hackney or with the decision to actually, commission the review itself. It begins a long time before that. So this didn't happen in isolation, where one day someone got up, read the Educating Hackney website and thought, oh my goodness, this is something that we need to look at. Department for Education, Hackney Education, local authority, lead member, many others had been engaging and working with the school because there was a growing concern about the number of issues that were being raised by a range of parents, but also actually by some present and former teachers who were reaching out saying, look, things aren't right. Things aren't right across the board. So obviously in a school as outstanding as Mossbourne, you just don't take that as read. You don't think, oh, well, someone said things aren't right there, so that must be true. So what you begin by doing is trying to collaborate to sensitively engage with the school leadership and say, look, how can we work together to ensure that parents' voices are being heard and ensure that there's a balanced approach taken to this, so that we can lance this at an early stage so that it doesn't escalate. And that went on for nearly a year. And in the latter part of that, I began to be drawn into it in my role. But primarily, I was encouraging Hackney Education, the Department of Education, and the school itself and others to come together and to find some form of consensus and a way forward. So for that year leading up to it, there'd been a lot of work being done, there'd been a lot of communication, but ultimately, this all came together when we began getting more correspondence in, and not just from the Educating Hackney website. And that correspondence identified a range of themes. So I arranged for a reassurance visit where I could go to the school and speak to school leaders about these issues and get some sense of reassurance from them, and of course be able to place the school in the context of having seen it. And I went to the school and I was impressed by the school, by the demeanor of the pupils that I engaged on a visit that I went to, walked through corridors, sat down and spoke to the chief executive, and the principal, and chatted through these issues. Within, I would say, a couple of hours of leaving the school, I began getting more emails from parents who realized that I'd been there, and more concerns were being unpacked. Within a couple of days, a teacher reached out to me, explaining their concern and sharing an email with me that basically demonstrated that the day before I went in, teachers received an email telling them to remove children from the desks in the corridors. So you will have heard of the concept of desking, where children, as a sanction, are placed on desks outside in the corridor. And there's a debate whether that's a sanction for them or a mechanism to facilitate, uninterrupted learning for others. But ultimately, the concern for me was that when I went in that day, there was no mention of it, that there was an email prior to me going in that instructed staff to bring those children back into the back of the classroom so that they weren't in the corridors. And there could be 101 different reasons for that. But if you put it in the context of the efforts that had been made to address some of the consistent and persistent concerns that were being raised about the school, that too triggered an additional level of concern. So we decided, on the back of all of the additional information, on the back of what we'd seen in the public arena, and what we'd heard from teachers, present and former, from other professionals, we decided to hold an extraordinary safeguarding review meeting. And that's where collectively professionals from health, including children and adolescents mental health, from the criminal justice system, from children's social care, from education, came together, considered the information that we had, and made the decision that the best way to ensure that we were addressing this would be to have a child safeguarding practice review. And that decision was made unanimously. And just to be very clear on this, it then went to the executive. So the most senior designated safeguarding partners from health, from children's social care, the local authority, and indeed from the police. And that was agreed at that level. And then we wrote to the national panel to say, look, this is what we intend to do, this is why we intend to do it, and this is how we intend to do it. And of course, as you know, they agreed that process. So I think that context, long-winded as it probably is for Saturday morning, is really, really important for people, so they understand this wasn't a knee-jerk response. Other, interventions had been attempted. But once you get to a particular point, Tom, and if you're a teacher listening to this, once you get to that point, you really have to address the problem. Otherwise, you're waiting for something to go wrong when people will ask the critical question, when you knew A, B, C, D, and E, why did you do nothing? Because we weren't prejudging events. We were creating a set of circumstances with terms of reference and what would ultimately be a highly credible independent author to make a much more informed judgment about what the situation really was. And from the beginning and to this date, I have always recognized and acknowledged the outstanding academic school that Mossbourne Victoria Park is. For the vast majority of its pupils, it's a great space that delivers an education that allows them opportunities in life they may not otherwise have. But balance is key. Balance is critical. And creating a safe space where all pupils, regardless of their ultimate ability, where they can all come together, live together, learn together, and thrive, is just so important.
What was and again, I'm not an expert on safeguarding, okay? You are, right? So what's the threshold that you were looking for to meet where you said this now needs to go to this stage or this level, and you said it was unanimous? Fair enough. So what was the threshold? Because on the report itself, I think point 1.8, it says a serious child safeguarding case is defined as one where abuse or neglect of a child is known or suspected and the child has died or been seriously harmed. And then it continues, in making this determination, the following definitions from the statutory guidance were considered relevant. And then there's 4 bullet points. It says a serious child safeguarding case, serious harm is set out in paragraph 329, abuse and maltreatment. Now, from what you've mentioned desking there, there's also comments in the report about shouting, not just shouting, but I guess the manner of the shouting, but yeah, shouting fundamentally, desking, and sort of, and again, people will define this however they define it, but strict zero tolerance sort of behavior policies and rules, which are prevalent across a lot of schools in the country. So I'm wondering, what was the threshold where you said this is serious enough for this?
Well, the threshold in this case, and you're quite right to highlight the points that you have, really came about in paragraph 338 of working together, where we have the power to review any systemic issues that may give us a local cause for concern that we quite rightly need to reflect upon. So if you look at the patterns of alleged behavior, if those patterns were accurate, if they were right, then that would fall under the definition of maltreatment, because ultimately shouting and humiliating, desking and isolating is maltreatment. And maltreatment is defined, in a way that recognizes the need for dignity in school. So at that stage, we weren't prejudging, but it most definitely, on the basis of the information that had come to us, met the threshold in respect of paragraph 338 for us to trigger the review as we did. And if you think about it, you mentioned shouting. Teachers, I have seen, online saying, do they know anything about schools? Of course you have to raise your voice. Of course you do. You're going to have to, at times, raise your voice to get attention. You're going to have to raise your voice to call people back in. But there's a difference between raising your voice and shouting in a performative manner, which one of the senior leaders said, well, yes, we do. We have this approach where we will shout in this performative manner at a child in front of other children to make the point that this type of behavior won't be tolerated, what does that teach anyone? What does that teach anyone? Because to some children, that type of shouting will be perceived as aggression. To those children, if they perceive teachers being aggressive, what does that teach them about seeking compliance in others? So there's no doubt in my mind this met the threshold. That doesn't mean that from the beginning, we had decided, oh, they're guilty of this. What it means is that from the beginning, we had met a threshold, which meant further inquiries needed to take place in a balanced and proportionate way to ensure, that we understood what was going on in the school and how the school perhaps could learn lessons. And I give you an example, from my point of view. I went and met with the chair of the Federation, Henry Colston, very late in the day when we had begun looking at the need to have a safeguarding review. And I met Henry face to face with a number of other people. In fact, at the time, I didn't realize he had the school lawyers in the room. But I went in and said, look, let's use this opportunity to collaborate, let the school embrace the learning opportunity in this so that we can work together to identify those areas where you've got strengths and those areas where you could be even better by strengthening how you do what you do. And I explained, that I'd been approached directly, by someone from the school in the days immediately before that, who was really concerned that they couldn't speak up for fear of what might happen. I left that meeting thinking we had achieved some agreement. I rang members of the exec to say, look, I think we've been able to find middle ground where we can collaborate and move together. And of course, that wasn't the case. The Federation, unlike any other child safeguarding practice review I've ever been in, decided rather than engage with the City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Board directly, that they would pay for and engage lawyers to act as the intermediary with us. And that was a real surprise. And I think it set a tone.
Do you think that's though because they were concerned about what the sort of independence and the I don't know, what the review was actually going to do, that they sort of got a bit, they went into their shell a little bit and thought this could be a hit job on us or whatever?
Well, I noticed you used Tom Bennett's phrase "hit job."
No, that wasn't intentional.
Yeah.
That's me coming from the
top
of
my
my
head.
I'm
not saying it was intentional, but it's a phrase that has been used.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of used defensively to distract. If the school felt that they were being singled out, why? Why didn't they expect that over a period of time when so many people had worked with them for so long to try and reconcile this, that it wouldn't come to a head? In every review that I've ever been involved in, I've been involved in lots, whether it's linked to Everyone's Invited, whether it was linked to National Health Trust, and indeed the review of Oxfam GB. The one thing that I find to be present in every environment where you ultimately see safeguarding that needs to be strengthened is hubris, is leadership that thinks they are at a level that is beyond reproach, or environments where they think they have nothing to learn. And that hubris is a symptom of deeper issues. And ultimately, as I said to you, I went and met with Henry because what we wanted was to have a collaborative and sensible approach where we could move forward together and the school could learn and we could support that learning. But ultimately, the school lawyered up. And that may be because they felt, well, we need to defend ourselves. What I am saying is I've never seen that happen before. Because at the end of the day, working with a statutory based review like a CSPR is something that you're required to do. So spending money, and I don't know where the money came from that they invested either in the lawyers that they used as intermediaries, or indeed for the KC who they commissioned to duplicate part of Sir Alan Wood's review. But to me, working together is about ensuring good use of public money so that the money that is available, and let's face it, there isn't enough money to support what teachers are doing across the board at the moment. So of course, I don't want schools having to spend additional funds that might better be spent on their SEND cohort, with their teachers or for educational purposes. So I don't understand why they did that. I can see what you're saying. But the fact of the matter is, hopefully anyone listening to this, with fair balance will see, that for a significant period of time, we did everything we could to avoid having a review, to reconcile these issues between the school and those that were concerned internally and externally. So I would refute that. I mean, why have a hit job? This isn't an attack on schools. We've got fantastic schools in Hackney that achieve the balance, providing pathways to better lives through education and supporting those to achieve whatever they are capable of within the restraints that are placed upon them. We live in an area, of significant deprivation. We have high levels of poverty mixed alongside, others who have much more. So blending our schools is critical, and so many of them do that so well. This isn't an attack on schools. It's not an attack on Mossbourne. They achieve fantastic academic outcomes. This is a concern about that school because of the weight, consistency, and persistence of the concerns that are being raised against them. And at the end of the day, Sir Alan Wood's report, and my feedback, even from people at the beginning who said, look, my child goes there, I think it's a great school. Even some of those people have come back to me to say, do you know what? I do see evidence of what Sir Alan's saying. And whilst it's okay for my child, I can see how it's not okay for others. So I think we've got to get beyond the adversarial nature of this. We've got to get to the next level where the Board of Governors, the trustees, who have shown an absence of professional curiosity when it comes to digging into the data that indicates that there is, in fact, disparity, there is disproportionality. And you can't sweep that under the carpet by saying, well, that's represented nationally. Is it represented nationally in your school, if you're a teacher listening, that, if you're a Black Caribbean boy, you're going to be 5.1% more likely to be in the behavioural support unit of the APC? Is that the case in your school? I'm not sure that it is, and I'm not sure that's in national representation. If you're a Black African boy, that you're going to be, over 4 times more likely than your white counterpart to be in BSU or APC. Is that the case in your school? In your school, do you shout performatively at children in the playground in front of others to humiliate them? So I think, people need to begin looking through this through their own experience and their own eyes. But we wanted to avert this. This is not an attack on schools. It's an opportunity, certainly, for schools to reflect and learn. And it's a critical opportunity and a watershed moment for MVPA. And I haven't seen a response from their governors, their trustees who are responsible for oversight, to say, we accept these recommendations. We're now moving at pace to address them. I haven't seen that. And that's worrying when you get this type of learning, that the impression I'm getting and the danger about people typifying this as a hit job or, as a malicious, kind of attempt to target one school. The danger in that is that some of the leadership team and some of the governors will think, well, we've got support, and that's why I was so concerned about that particular blog from someone who is working with the Department of Education as a behavioral, expert. I mean, when someone in that job, no matter how they try and caveat it as being personal, comes out and decries and belittles and undermines a report from someone with the impeccable credentials of Sir Alan Wood in this field, then no wonder people in governing bodies think, well, maybe it's not really that good a report and perhaps we don't need to read it. I've even seen people speculating online that Alan Wood, the author of the review, is a social worker. Do you know what his background is, Tom?
I don't know.
No, because I've seen that speculation about him being a social worker. He was a history teacher. And as a teacher, he specialized in behavioral issues within schools. Sir Alan Wood, the author of this report, was instrumental when he was working in Hackney for bringing Mossbourne there. He worked alongside, Sir Michael Wiltshire. And I'd be really interested to hear what Sir Michael Wiltshire thinks of where we are now and the way this particular debate is being handled. But not only did he help bring Mossbourne there, Sir Alan Wood helped bring another 6 academies at least there. To my understanding, he worked with the Department of Education in the previous government to create the Wood Review. in 2018, which looked at how we can change the way we reflect on safeguarding, across the board with local authorities and relevant agencies like schools. So he's someone with impeccable credentials. And I thought if I was going to get pushback, if we, the city and Hackney Safeguarding Children Board, were going to be pushed back on conflict, it would actually be from parents and carers and critics of Mossbourne, because Alan had that particular background. So if you're going to attack the author's credibility, you need to do your homework first, because this is someone who's embedded in education, who's worked to help improve it. And from the individuals, including some of the governors who have engaged with him since the review, there is a genuine sense in those who are not becoming incendiary that there's a piece of work to be done in the aftermath of this. And that's going to require collaboration. That's going to require, calm heads, where we can think, how do we make this school even better? How do we make it even better by making sure that no matter who you are, you can go there and get the best opportunity of an education? One of the things, thanks for that. I mean, we'll come back to that maybe at the end. We'll circle back to it. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about is the evidence. So we've talked about the threshold. So you've sort of explained that you felt the things that had been submitted, whether by the Educating Hackney website, whether external to that, the things that have been submitted by this group of parents and some teachers and some other people about the practices that were happening had reached the threshold in you and others' view of this safeguarding review. The bit I wanted to move on to next was the evidence itself. So many allegations in the report, from reading it, were they independently verified? How were they fact checked? Did you apply any sort of evidential threshold to the findings? As in, example here from just our wider audience will understand this. Now, if you probably went into any school and sort of said, here's a form, to sort of make whatever complaints you want to make about what's happening, they'd probably get a lot of submissions, I would imagine, in any school, even really good schools. I mean, we were talking the other week on TTR about this sort of complaints crisis, if you want to call it, in education, with AI being involved and everything else. Point I'm making is, my two questions are, how were the accusations, allegations, whatever you want to call them, about what was happening in the school sort of fact-checked or independently verified? What were the processes there involved? Did you observe lessons? How was it done? Okay. Well, just before I go on to that, to answer that, let me just be very clear. It didn't sort of meet the threshold. It was tested by a multi-agency audience and agreed that it did meet the threshold. And indeed, the national panel, the ultimate arbiters on that, agreed with that as well. What Sir Alan did through the methodology was evidence-rich. So he didn't just take a single allegation and decide, well, this must be true. Because we understand, right across the public sector and private sector for that matter, when you invite criticism, you're going to get criticism. So it is about how you balance that. And that's why in his report, he acknowledged, that the significant levels of community-based support for the school, the significant levels of support amongst some of the staff and others. So he realized that he was going to have to triangulate the evidence in order to make a sensible judgment. And that wasn't, that he stood with a pen and drew a triangle around it, as someone has suggested. That means that he used testimony from multiple stakeholders across multiple settings. So he engaged with some of the teachers who did work there before, some of the teachers who were still working there, to see, does this resonate? Is this what's being said by this significant number of individuals out there? I mean, when you talk about the Educating Hackney, as if it's, well, we'll write that off because they're activists. We'll write that off because, the most senior leaders in the school are saying it's vexatious. I just want to stress, Jim, I'm not writing it off. I'm referencing... I know you're not. I'm speaking in on a personal level. I'm speaking in general terms to the audience that has attempted to write it off. The submissions that came in via that, contained significant submissions from a vast number of teachers there were critical concerns. So you take those concerns and you think, okay, I've got the concerns. Let's look at the school's data. Let's look at the school's data to see if what we're being told about the disproportionality is accurate. And of course, you look at the school's data, which took us 8 months to get. We asked for it in January. We asked for that data in January 2025, and we weren't able to get it until September and later, so that we were able to interrogate it. Now, is that someone embracing and engaging with the learning opportunity? Is that someone delaying? I don't know. But so we looked at the data, and Sir Alan interrogated that, and that data supported the principles of the concerns that he was hearing. He then, spoke to some of the senior leaders and some of the trustees, and you had trustees saying, "Look, I've raised issues with some of the leadership team, and said, look, the shouting isn't appropriate, or why is that being done?" To be told, well, that. Don't listen to that. That's none of your business type of thing. Well, if you told me that as a trustee, you'd have a real problem. So I'm expecting professional curiosity. But he also took evidence from individuals who'd been, at training events where the healthy fear culture was being purported. Now, what is healthy fear? How is fear ever healthy? Being cautious, being respectful, understanding limits and boundaries, but healthy fear. And so this wasn't just taken from a one-dimensional document. This was tested against the testimony from people with lived experience within the school, from professionals who had engaged with the school, and ultimately from the data that we recovered from the school, from the minutes of meetings. So there is, you can talk about the no excuses policy and say it's different from zero tolerance. I'd like to know how no excuses is different from zero tolerance, because in the mind's eye of most people, it's the same. Now, there will be nuance in the application. And, Mossbourne brought in its own KC, to carry out a review of the policy rather than the practice that was there. But that KC's findings actually triangulate with Alan's, because they looked in a very narrow sense around complaints. Communication with parents needs to be improved. The process wasn't fit for purpose. In this day and age, parents couldn't engage via email. So
you mentioned the statistics, Jim, just to sort of, because we've got limited time, so I want to be able to dig into that a little bit. In the report, it says that 66% of incidents were to do with male pupils. So is that, how does that compare to other Hackney or inner city schools?
Well, I think the male, if we're talking male versus female students, I don't think that is considerably different to what you will find in other areas with a similar, demographic. And I think, from my point of view,
it was highlighted in the report as a point.
No, I understand that, and it's Alan's report, and Alan can speak to that. But if you're going to, here's the thing. If we say, well, this happens everywhere, it's not right, but it happens everywhere. Do we accept that? Do we say, well, that's okay, we don't need to worry about that? And here's the other thing. When you're talking about a school that applies, is engaged in, on average, 154 discipline incidents a day, resulting in 93 sanctions, such as detention, per day, and that's looking at 3 years worth of data, do you not begin to question whether that's working or not? Because if you've done it in year one and it hasn't reduced the incidences in year two, there's a problem. If it hasn't reduced the incidents in year three, there's a problem.
There'll be those though who would respond to that, Jim, by looking at, for example, the parental surveys that came in. So if what you're saying is right, and that the parents, who are obviously key, aren't happy with it, in the survey carried out, I think in the March of 2025 by MVPA, they got 429 responses, which sounds a lot from just looking at it. And 92% felt their child is safe at the academy. 95% agreed the school has high expectations of their child, and 91% thought pupils are well behaved. So does that mirror with what you're saying?
But then you need to look at the percentages at the bottom end of that, where parents are saying that, their concerns about bullying, their concerns about communication, and their concerns about how particular children are treated, because that shows you're talking about the 10% minority. Well, for me, a 10% minority of parents, at the end of the day, if they're representing 80 children in that school, and they may have more than one child, that's a concern. It should be a concern to any teacher.
But how does that compare to other schools, though? For example,
but we're not examining other schools at this moment in time. That's for other schools to take this data and make that. What I am saying is, if you're going to use their own survey, which is fine, and I absolutely do think it's a great thing that they did it. I think the year before they only had 179 people participate in it. So the heightened tension and the appeals from the school, I'm sure, will have influenced more people to come forward. And as you've said, if under certain circumstances you ask people to give you an opinion, they will give you one. But even at that, if you drill into the data and go down, so it says where about bullying and where there are issues about communication, you'll see that you've got much higher percentages, up to 20% in some of those cases where parents have concerns. So it's a mixed bag, and you're never going to get 100%. But where's your threshold? Tom, in your school today, are you going to be content if 20% of the parents aren't happy about the mechanism that you have to communicate with them? Are you going to be content if a KC comes in and says your communication and your complaints process is not really fit for purpose, and then someone of Sir Alan's comes in and says, I agree with that, and the impact of it is this? Are you going to lie back and say, well, other schools might be similar? Because that's not been our finding. In fact, when you look at the significant minority who reflect their concerns through that, those concerns are reflected in the 2016, the 2021, and the 2023 Ofsted report, and they're reflected in the contemporary engagement with Sir Alan Wood in the lead up to this. So we can talk about this, about how it was done, why it was done, and when it was done. But the fact of the matter is, I'm glad it was, because there's a significant minority of children who are disproportionately, impacted by the no excuses policy, by the lack of agility or flexibility to be able to make adjustments for our children with special education needs and disabilities. Those children should be safe. Those children should be nurtured. And I'm not stupid. I know that in classrooms, my wife was a teacher for 30 years, taught in some of the Belfast schools in areas that are very challenging. I know that it's difficult for teachers when students become physically or verbally abusive, and measures have to be taken. But that's where you test the character of teaching. That's where you look at the application of moderated, proportionate approaches. My eldest daughter is a special needs teacher in an MLD and SLD school. I know the challenges that are there for teachers. This isn't about decrying them. This is about celebrating the teachers who are getting it right. And you know what I'd be really proud of if I was a teacher? Those teachers that came forward, because there is a culture, whether it's a perception of that or not, the impact of it is that some teachers in that school feel they cannot speak up or speak out for fear of the consequence. There are parents in that school. Whenever I got 15 emails in the immediate aftermath of my visit to the school, I wrote back to them and said, please go directly to the school on this. And if you can't get satisfaction at the school, go to Department for Education. But what we learned was those parents had lost confidence in the competence of the school to deal with them. And when you look at the absence of low-level complaints, when you look at the absence of data recording, you've got to simply ask yourself, what have the trustees been doing? Because one of the things that we should have got by reassurance is trustees saying, well, you know what, in a borough like Hackney, we're very actively anti-racist. So we're looking at this data all the time, and we're looking at it and we're drilling into it to try and understand why particular groups, are being more disproportionately disadvantaged than others. But we don't see evidence of that. So trustees across the board, not just in MVPA, but in other places, can choose two types of approach. One is observational, where you just listen to the briefings you get. But two is actually proactive scrutiny, where you question, where you dig deeper, because your role, you are individually and collectively responsible for how the school operates beyond the executive control, obviously, of the chief executive and the senior leadership team. So I don't want, as we're approaching, kind of near the end of this, for people to go away thinking that the City of Hackney Safeguarding Children Board, is targeting schools. Absolutely not. We are celebrating schools. What we are doing, though, is we're focusing on the lived experience of our families, of our children and young people, to make sure that wherever they go to school, they have the best possible opportunity. And I don't want children going to a school like Mossbourne Victoria Park Academy, which is outstanding academically, and actually feeling pushed out. Why shouldn't they have the opportunities that a school like that provides?
But
why can't
again,
there be reasonable adjustment?
I understand, listening completely to everything you're saying. You're making some very strong and interesting points. But the issue, I guess the critics out there are saying, but comparison is important because, as you've rightly just said, you've said we're not looking to sort of, for this to necessarily apply to lots of other schools, let's say, right, in exactly the same way. But comparison is surely important when it comes to, for example, parental feedback and questionnaires or whatever, whatever data you use. Surely it's important to look, at what other schools are doing. For example, there's another school near this particular school that saw 35% of parents said they wouldn't recommend the school in their Ofsted report. 7% said their child didn't feel safe. So it's how that's a comparable school nearby. Another school, different school that's also near the school, had only 2 parent responses to Ofsted. So yeah. I mean, Mossbourne's had through this report, the parental engagement seems, from the outside point of view, to be extremely strong.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is, if there are persistent and consistent complaints drawn to the attention of others, I mean, what we'd need to know about those schools is how did they engage with Ofsted? Did Ofsted follow up to ensure that those concerns had been addressed? Because that's perhaps why they didn't come to us. But if you want to look at comparators, of course, it's right to do that. I have carried out numerous reviews, commissioned many, many more, and I've never seen a school engage as adversarially as this one. If you want a comparator, look at the criticisms coming out of Thurrock and the Mossbourne schools there. And I would be asking myself the question, why is that not being further scrutinized? But when you want to look at comparators, we can look at the academic achievement, but I still come back to the disproportionality around, you've got 16% of the student cohort are SEND. 27% are represented, in discipline issues and thereafter the sanctions. Is that right? When you look at the fact that the Black and global majority population are 2 times more likely than their white counterparts to suffer a sanction or to be given a sanction, and then you look at the behavioural support unit, which, if you read Sir Alan's report, is about containing children, not educating them. Well, that runs against the Department for Education guidelines, as I think does desking in the circumstances where it's occurred. But you're more likely, you're 5 times and nearly 4 times. Have you heard this
phrase desking before? I'll be honest, Jim, I hadn't heard the phrase desking prior to this report. Maybe that's just me being in my own bubble of teaching, the teaching world, but I hadn't come across it before.
Well, I'm glad you haven't.
Is it not? I mean, in the schools I've worked in, for a student to be, I don't know, sent out of a classroom and either sent to a senior leader and have to sit in their office or just outside their office, or if they're not available, to sit in a corridor space with the senior leader, to me, that's happened in many, 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 many schools.
Does it happen every day in your school?
No, but it happens regularly.
No, but does it happen every day in your school? And if you had a visitor attending the school, would you give instructions to take the children out of the corridor and put them at the back of the classroom? In your school, would you, as a teacher, if you were in the playground today and you saw a fellow teacher and a senior one to you shouting at children, actually described in some of the evidence as screaming, is that something you see in your school every day? Because if we want comparators, every teacher out there, do your own comparator. Ask yourself whether your children are being disproportionately represented in the way that the statistical basis of Mossbourne's own data indicates that these children and young people are. I don't want to castigate. I want to engage. This is about learning. This is about positive change. We're not a conduct organization. It's for the Board of Governors to decide whether within this the data that they now have from us, from Sir Alan Wood's review, whether they want to investigate that further to establish who did what, where, and when. And we've passed the themes to them. We've also passed to the Board of Governors a number of names where there's specific allegations about specific individuals. And in your school, tell me this, Tom, if you were the most senior person in the school or one of the senior leadership team and a complaint was made against you, would you pass that to a subordinate to investigate? Do you think that's a proportionate response? Would that fill you with confidence that one of your senior leaders were being investigated by a subordinate?
There's no doubt by anybody reading the report, and this is including all our listeners and viewers that have fed in, there's no doubt that even the critics of the report would have said that, you know, every school in the country, I mean, you would struggle to find a single school or school leadership team in the entire country that wouldn't have weaknesses or things that they've done. Also, in you know, to take into my career and reflective points that they need to address. In my career, you know, I'm up to nearly year 20. I've seen that, you know, lots of things like you just described from, you know, I guess the point comes to whether you judge something to be systemic or not, because you can go over the last 20 years, you know, and yeah, I could give you examples of incidents, singular incidents involving singular members of staff, because that's like saying, you know, in any profession, there aren't individuals who aren't doing the job.
Individuals aren't the issue.
It's when the leadership. I'm not disputing that.
So if you're going to have, you know, no excuses, then let's play that back to leaders. No excuses. No excuses if you allow a culture like this to plant seeds, if it's then fertilized by the behavior of some of your own staff, and if it's not then scrutinized by your governing body. And I would like to think over your 20 years that you have used a safeguarding first lens, that where you see this type of conduct or behavior coming from those in positions of authority, that you challenge it. And that's what some of the teachers haven't felt able to challenge publicly, but they've felt able to share their concerns privately. And if that was just one, well, then you'd say, okay. But, you know, they're being written off by certain people linked to the school as well. They're aggrieved. You know, they're just individuals. You know, they've got some point to score. The evidence proves that's not the case. It's time now to move beyond the adversarial nature of this and begin a process of rebuilding confidence in the competence of the school, not just to do what it does well, but to change the way it deals with the most vulnerable children that it hosts, engages, and hopefully educates.
Did you get contacted in the review by parents who were very much sort of against what you were sort of saying? I mean, during the review process, I mean, did you seek out the views of this, however, percentage of parents who think different?
I mean, some parents did approach the review. We know there were 300 signatures plus went into newspaper. All of that, I think you'd have to ask Sir Alan of how he took account of that, but I know he did. In fact, I'm saying you'd need to ask him. What you'd need to do is read his report, because he actually articulates that within the report. So this is not an Ofsted inspection. You know, and Ofsted inspections need to be radically improved, and I hope they're moving in a direction where their lens focuses more on SEND, focuses more on behavior, because their own reports actually all had hints of the systemic issues that we're building over a number of years here. But at the end of the day, you can see in Sir Alan's that he recognizes the school's strengths. This review wasn't about, you know, echoing the school's strengths that are rightly the purview of Ofsted. This review was about looking at those areas that needed to be significantly strengthened, because a significant minority of parents of pupils in the school, you know, had raised concerns that were echoed by staff and by other safeguarding professionals. So we need to move forward. I think we need to move away from the adversarial nature of this. You can do your comparisons till the cows come home. I believe the disproportionality in the isolation sits well above any national standard. I believe that when you look at the levels of discontent that have been there for some time, you know, it's not just Sir Alan's review, it's Anne White KC, you know, a highly credible King's Counsel who looks at the failure within the complaint system. You can't even write your complaint in on email. I mean, you can dissuade people from complaining till the cows come home. You expect that maybe in a commercial entity. You don't expect it in a school. And I think people have got to step back. And I haven't seen as many critics of this report as are being echoed in some areas. I've seen 4 or 5 people who, to be honest, I won't, but I could link together for their own particular mutual interest.
Well, that was going to be my last. That was going to be my last question, Jim. Is you've brought in there Tom Bennett earlier. I've seen comments by Andrew Old and other people on social media about the report. You've mentioned 4 or 5. What would your sort of message to those critics be? What do you mean when you say the 4 or 5 have shared interests, and what would your sort of final point on that be?
Well, I think they share an interest, and I could be wrong, in the ideology that they promote in the echo chamber, that they participate within. And I think they've got to step out of that. And then particularly, Andrew Old asks question after question after question, and you answer it every time. But because he doesn't like the answer, it's that you didn't answer it. I mean, if he were in one of these no excuses schools, he'd probably be suffering a detention. But ultimately, I think people like Tom Bennett, who have critical influence. I mean, he has critical influence. I mean, I've read a number of his other blogs, which are balanced, which are proportionate. And then suddenly this knee-jerk reaction comes out because it seems to be kicking off an ideological battle about discipline versus non-discipline. It's not that. I am told time and time again by heads and others, and I was told it during the Child Q review, order, structure, and discipline are key. And when I ask children and young people, and I engage with over 100 of them in the Child Q review, not in spaces and places where I was comfortable, but where they were in different clubs and youth clubs and sports clubs. And they agreed that that's important. But so is consistency. So is fairness. Consistency and fairness is context. And so is treating people with dignity, leading by example. So no one's saying that you shouldn't have order, structure, and discipline. But the context within which it's delivered needs to be about, consistency, fairness, dignity. Set the example for your children, no matter how difficult that might be at times, so that they can grow, to be better people on the basis of the example that you have set. So look, thank you for your time today, Tom. I really appreciate it. And I thought, about coming on because it's always difficult in the heat of a moment. But I wanted to take the opportunity to speak directly to, teachers, teaching assistants and staff and leaders. This is not a judgment on education. Mossbourne itself are doing a great job academically. There are lessons in this that we should all reflect upon to make sure that we're not losing line of sight on that minority of pupils who need adjustments. Don't be the person that goes onto Twitter and laughs about someone needing, a fidget toy. I mean, you just demean yourself when you do that. Be the person that reflects on how can we make sure that everyone can achieve their full potential, no matter how that's limited within the education system that you work so hard to deliver.
Jim, I want to give a special thanks to you for coming on and sharing your context and sort of everything really about the report and where it's come from. Really, really appreciate it. I'm sure we've got lots of viewers and listeners. We've had quite a few comments actually throughout that I haven't had a chance to share, but we've got lots of people who are coming on and sharing their views on what you said. So huge appreciation for coming on, and thank you.
Thank you. Cheers, thank you, Tom.
Hi. That was Jim Gamble, who was part of the Mossbourne Safeguarding Review. Just another shout out to our supporters and partners at Teachers Talk Radio, Hachette Learning. They are providers of professional development books and resources to schools around the world. Level up your professional development today by visiting them at the Hachette Learning website. Check it out just in time for Christmas. Fill those stockings with some Hachette Learning books. We've had 400 viewers on today's show, one-off show with Jim Gamble. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anywhere else, please give us a like and subscribe. Your support is massively appreciated by everyone at Teachers Talk Radio, the whole team, including me. Really appreciate your support and engagement with what we do and what we try to do. So yeah, what an interview. Really, really interesting. So many points to go away and reflect on, and so many things to think about and move from. I think tomorrow on Teachers Talk Radio, we're going to continue this conversation with a little reflection on what we've seen and heard over the last week or so in this story. So tomorrow at 10 a.m. on Points of View. If you're a regular watcher or listener of Points of View, you know it's fantastic. We've got an amazing panel tomorrow, our last Points of View of the year. So join us for that. It'll be 10 a.m. tomorrow live on Twitter, on X, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, and on Facebook. So yeah, if you want to watch that, we'll be discussing further the Mossbourne Safeguarding review, the things that Jim has said in the interview today, and going from there. So thank you ever so much for tuning in, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend. Hopefully the first weekend of your holiday, as it might be, and take care. See you soon.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.